Welcome to the second video in our series where I discuss how Torque, Quality's environment as a service platform, helps simplify and speed application delivery. This video will talk about how using blueprints help in that delivery process. I referenced in a previous video the value of infrastructure as code in automating infrastructure provisioning. When infrastructure as code tools were first introduced, it represented a huge step forward, freeing developers from a heavy dependence on IT to set up environments. However, because these ended up being highly customized environments, organizations had different sets of environments for each development stage, leading to code sprawl and maintenance issues. From the perspective of building an application using a CICD pipeline, the developer writes and checks in code that is continuously merged with other contributed code that will be tested, released to the repo, and then deployed to production. The CICD pipeline is an effective way to build software as a standard and repeatable process that ensures the latest version is in production. The challenge, however, is that the process lacks governance over cloud access and associated costs, exposing organizations to security risks and cost overrun. This is where the value of Torque blueprints come in. Torque builds in access control and cloud access specific to the need of the developer. Admins are able to control usage and access to the company's cloud accounts by configuring the blueprints with specific parameters and instructions. Using blueprints also simplifies the process to adapt into changes. I'll show you a little of what can be configured in a blueprint from a blueprint designer's perspective and launching a sandbox using that same blueprint but from a user's perspective. Let's say as a user, I need to build a web application on WordPress. I need access to a cloud account running on a LAMP stack. But first, the blueprint designer needs to configure the blueprint with the specific parameters. Once they do that, as a user, I can use that as a template to create multiple web apps or test it before sending it to production. To start, I will log in and ensure that I'm in the right space. We refer to space as a workspace for a group of people or a team to work on a specific project. Today, I'll be spinning up this environment on AWS. I'll click on Blueprints and make sure the Published Blueprints Only is toggled on. From there, I click on the blueprint that matches my cloud provider, WordPress Basic Stack on AWS, and then hit the YAML toggle on the top right. This is an example blueprint to use as a template for your application. One thing to note is that every blueprint must have at least one application, but each blueprint can provide multiple applications and services. You can modify the YAML file values or set defaults in your code editor of choice, or modify these directly in GitHub by clicking on the settings, then the repositories tab, and then the link right here. I navigate to the blueprints, and then select the same file I selected in Torque, the WordPress Basic Stack on AWS. Let's go back to Torque to view these fields that can be modified to ensure the blueprint meets the user's needs before they can launch the sandbox. Here, I'm using spec version 1. For kind, this tells the Torque which type of YAML file it is. In this case, I'm using it to build a blueprint. For the metadata field, this currently only supports a description which will be used in the Torque UI for the blueprint, giving the user further instruction. The clouds field is where I entered the cloud provider name. This name must match exactly in order for it to work. This is also where you specify which region. For inputs, these are variables given to the users to allow them to make changes. And finally, applications. This is the most important part of the blueprint. I'm telling Torque which apps to deploy and how. In this case, one instance of MySQL and one instance of WordPress. There are lots of properties that an application can have, which can describe how many apps to deploy, which instance to use, and so on. You can see or set the parameters here as well. Here I will focus on just two, input values and depends on. Input values are the variables I pass from the blueprint to be used as environment variables in your application init, start, or health check scripts. The important things to know are, if you define an input on the blueprint, it must be in the app YAML file. You can set values for these directly, or use input name to pull the value from the blueprint inputs. You can also use the built-in variables, like the Sandbox ID or outputs from other applications or services. Depends on is basically what it sounds like. You can control the order of application or service deployment, like if you need a backend app to set up first for your UI app to use. One other important thing to note is if you are using the output from another app or service as an input, you must have a dependency defined, otherwise the blueprint validation will fail. The last important thing to note is the debugging option. I'll talk about this once the sandbox is launched. Now that we have all the settings configured, let me use the Torque UI to use this blueprint WordPress basic stack on AWS to launch a sandbox. I first go to Sandbox Environments, then create a new sandbox. What I showed you earlier was how to configure the blueprint, and using what I configured as a template to create sandboxes, including a sample one I'll do now. I create a name here, and then set the duration of how long I'll need the sandbox for. I'll adjust it to 1 hour. Here are the parameters that I can change, but I will leave it as is. Once I'm done configuring this, I simply click on Launch Sandbox, and within a minute I see the confetti to indicate that the sandbox was created successfully. I open the sandbox and can see it processing. Here you can see the deployment lifecycle, the timeline on how long the sandbox has been active, who launched it. Down here you can see the blueprint being used along with the cloud provider and region that was used, the parameters when we launched the sandbox, as well as the quick links that I'll show you shortly once the sandbox is deployed. I will go ahead and speed this up in the video editing process, but for this sandbox it takes about 6 minutes to set up. This will vary depending on how big the environment is. Back to debugging, the beneficial thing about Torque is when this option is enabled, it gives you an automatically generated link in the troubleshooting tab that you can use to SSH or RDP into your application instance. Here you can check your application state directly or look at relevant logs if your app is not working as expected. So let's go back and check to see if our quick links is ready. If we see the WordPress UI, that will indicate that we've successfully used the blueprint as designed within Torque. I can now build my web application on this LAMP stack running WordPress. If I need to create another web application, I can simply click on the blueprint and create another sandbox to run. This concludes the video on blueprints using Torque. I invite you to try out Torque for free by going to our website www.quali.com and clicking on the trial button.